Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just dive right in, shall we? Today, we're tackling one of ancient history's most complex, fiercely debated, and, honestly, absolutely fascinating texts, the Book of Daniel. We're going to break down the history, the brilliant structure, and those incredibly vivid visions that have literally captivated readers for millennia.
But right off the bat, we've got to ask, how do you actually decipher a book that's just packed with mutant beasts, fiery furnaces, and what look like secret codes? If you've spent any time in this text, you know it is absolutely loaded with wild, almost psychedelic imagery. But, as we'll see, none of this is random. Not at all. Every bizarre creature, every specific number, it all serves a very intentional purpose.
So, to make sense of all this, here's our roadmap for today. First, the prophet in exile. Second, a bilingual masterpiece. Third, statues, beasts, and empires. Fourth, the authorship debate. And finally, number 5, the Son of Man.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the prophet in exile.
Okay, so picture this. The year is 605 BC. Daniel, who's this brilliant young guy without any physical defects, has been taken captive by the massive Babylonian Empire. And he gets thrust into this intense re-education program to learn the language, the literature, and the whole culture of Babylon. It's out of this incredibly high-pressure environment that a genre called apocalyptic literature really emerges. Basically, this is a type of prophetic writing that looks forward to a time when good is finally going to triumph. It's a literature born out of intense stress and oppression, specifically designed to give a captive people some much-needed hope.
You can kind of think of these elements as your rule book for reading Daniel. I mean, when you encounter the heavy use of dreams, symbolic numbers, and fantastic cartoon-like imagery, it completely changes how you approach the text, right? You don't read this like a standard historical logbook. Those exaggerated, larger-than-life features in the visions, they're meant to drive home massive spiritual and political realities to an audience that was facing real, terrifying oppression.
Moving right along to Section 2, a bilingual masterpiece. So here's a wild fact. A huge portion of Daniel isn't even written in Hebrew. It's actually written in Aramaic. And Aramaic was basically the lingua franca, the global language of the ancient world. Think of it like this. If you travel globally today, you can usually get by using English. Well, in the ancient Near East back then, you got by with Aramaic. And the author uses this linguistic flip to structure his entire message.
It creates this absolutely brilliant sandwich structure. Just look at how the language intentionally shifts depending on who the audience is. Chapter 1 is in Hebrew, focusing intimately on God's people in exile. But then, for chapters 2 through 7, boom, the text switches to Aramaic. And you might be wondering why. Well, because these specific prophecies and events concern the global stage, the nations of the world. Then, in chapters 8 through 12, as the focus narrows right back down to the specific, difficult future of the Jewish people, it switches back to Hebrew. The structure itself is literally part of the message.
That brings us to Section 3, statues, beasts, and empires.
Embedded right inside these chapters is a sweeping historical timeline of 4 major kingdoms that will conquer and oppress this region. We kick things off with Babylon in 605 BC, transitioning over to Medo-Persia in 539 BC. Then we see the lightning-fast conquest of Greece under Alexander the Great in 333 BC, and finally, the unstoppable arrival of Rome in 63 BC. Now, Daniel's text maps out this entire succession of power, but it actually does so through 2 very, very different lenses.
The absolutely crucial point here is how these empires are perceived. In chapter 2, you've got this arrogant pagan king Nebuchadnezzar who has a dream about these 4 kingdoms. And how does he see human empire? He sees it as a towering, glorious, shiny statue made of all these precious metals. But then fast forward to chapter 7, Daniel receives a vision of those exact same 4 kingdoms. And how does the divine perspective view them? As terrifying, mutant, predatory beasts. It is such a stark visual contrast between human pride and the ugly, destructive reality of imperial power.
Let's take a closer look at these bizarre predators, because it's pretty wild. First, we have a lion with torn wings, given a human heart, which represents Babylon being humbled. Next up, a bear raised up on one side. This represents the Medo-Persian Empire's sort of lopsided strength, where the Persians were definitely the dominant ones. Then we get a swift leopard with 4 bird wings and 4 heads. Kind of crazy, right? But it perfectly captures Greece's incredibly rapid, tenacious conquest, with those 4 heads symbolizing the 4 generals who took over after Alexander the Great died. And finally, this terrifying beast with iron teeth that just crushes its victims, representing the sheer overwhelming might of Rome.
All right, on to Section 4, the authorship debate.
Because this text maps out the rise and fall of these empires with such extreme specificity. I mean, especially the actions of Greek rulers like Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jewish temple in 167 BC, it has naturally fueled a massive academic divide. On one hand, the critical view argues that the text must have been written in the 2nd century BC, meaning after these events took place, basically history disguised as prophecy. But on the other hand, the traditional view maintains a 6th century BC date. They argue that an omniscient God gave predictive prophecy to Daniel to prepare the Jewish people for the really hideous stress they were going to face centuries later. We're just looking at both sides here, but you can definitely see why it's such a hot topic.
Now, those holding the traditional view love to point to some pretty fascinating archaeological evidence, like the artifact you're seeing right here, the Nabonidus cylinder. See, in chapter 5 of Daniel, the text says Daniel is offered the position of 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. For the longest time, critics were like, why not 2nd? Well, artifacts exactly like this one revealed that King Nabonidus was actually off on a long sabbatical worshiping a moon god down in Arabia, which left his son Belshazzar to co-reign in Babylon. So mathematically, the highest available position to actually offer Daniel really was 3rd. It's this incredibly obscure Babylonian court detail that the author gets exactly right.
Beyond just historical details, Daniel also deals with some staggering timelines, particularly the number 490. Over in chapter 9, the text lays out this prophecy of 77s, 70 periods of 7 years, which totals 490 years. And this time is decreed to finish transgression and bring in an anointed one, a Messiah. To put that into perspective, this specific timeline fueled an absolute explosion of messianic expectation in the ancient world. By the time the 1st century rolled around, people knew their Bibles, they did the math, and they knew the exact time was approaching for a ruler to emerge.
Which brings us perfectly to our final section. Section 5, the Son of Man.
Back in chapter 7, right after that terrifying vision of the beastly empires, thrones are set in place, and the Ancient of Days takes his seat for judgment. And then Daniel says this, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven." This figure approaches the Ancient of Days and is given absolute authority, glory, and an everlasting sovereign power over all nations. Guys, this is a monumental moment in the text.
And this single phrase echoes so dramatically through history. Centuries later, Jesus is on trial before the high priest Caiaphas in Matthew 26. When Caiaphas demands under oath to know if he is the Son of God, Jesus responds by quoting this exact text from Daniel 7. Caiaphas instantly tears his clothes and screams blasphemy. Why such an extreme reaction? Because by quoting this, Jesus was dropping the ultimate theological mic. In the book of Ezekiel, the phrase Son of Man just meant a human prophet. But in Daniel, this Son of Man receives the eternal worship and dominion that belongs only to God. Jesus was intentionally claiming to be both fully human and fully God.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground today, from bilingual literary structures to mutant beasts and the highest courts of heaven. So I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up this explainer. If an ancient text can so precisely map out the chaotic rise and fall of earthly empires, what does its ultimate promise of a divine everlasting kingdom mean for you today? It's a profound reminder of a sovereignty that outlasts every single human power. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those deep questions, and I'll catch you next time.